In the Middle Ages, marriage was rarely about love or emotional connection. It was a practical agreement, often between families, clans, or even kingdoms. Noble marriages were especially political, used to forge alliances and secure power. Peasant marriages were more about survival and maintaining farmland or inheritance. Children, sometimes as young as 12 or 13, were promised to each other. Parents arranged the match, sometimes even before the children were born. Dowries were critical property, livestock, or money from the bride's family. The groom's family expected a dowry in exchange for taking on the bride. In noble families, the bigger the dowry, the better the match. Love that could come later or not at all. Consent wasn't always considered, especially for young girls. The church did require verbal consent, but in reality, it was often forced. Some girls were married off to much older men to benefit their father's status. For peasants, a match could mean access to more land or shared tools. In both rich and poor families, marriage was less personal and more transactional. Social class determined everything whom you could marry and how. Illegitimate marriages or love marriages without approval was scandalous. Many couples met for the first time on the wedding day itself. Courtship, as we know it today, hardly existed. There were no romantic dates, no secret love letters. Instead, negotiations happened between fathers and uncles. For royalty, marriages were often arranged between different countries. It was unrare for a bride to be shipped off to a foreign land she'd never seen. Language barriers didn't matter, politics did. The idea of marrying for love was considered foolish and irresponsible. People had roles. 2 play daughters were pawns, and sons were heirs. Even within villages, marriage kept resources within reach. You didn't just marry a person, you married into their work, land, and name. So before we romanticize medieval weddings, we should remember this. They were more contract than commitment and certainly not about passion. Medieval wedding ceremonies were deeply influenced by the church. But before Christianity became widespread, older pagan traditions were common. Eventually, the church absorbed and restructured many of these rituals. By the 12th century, marriage was recognized as a Christian sacrament. The ceremony often took place outside the church, near its entrance. Why? Because it was a public contract before God and the community. A priest would ask both parties to state their consent out loud. This was called the I do moment, though it wasn't exactly romantic. Witnesses were essentially usually family members and community elders. The couple would then exchange a token, like a ring or a belt. The church encouraged modesty, so wedding dresses were simple. Wealthier brides might wear fur-lined gowns, silk veils, or embroidered cloaks. But there were no white dresses. White didn't become popular until much later. Grooms usually wore their best tunic or armor, if they were of noble birth. Music, if present, came from minstrels, not orchestras. After the vows, the priest would bless the couple and their union. There might be a short sermon about duty, fidelity, and Christian values. The ceremony was quick compared to modern weddings. Feasting and celebration often mattered more than the ceremony itself. It was common for peasants to marry without priests if one wasn't nearby. These were called common law marriages and were accepted socially, but the church eventually cracked down and demanded official blessings. Even kings and queens needed the church's approval to make it legitimate. Without it, children might be considered illegitimate or able to inherit. Some weddings were postponed until the dowry was paid in full. Until then, the couple was technically engaged, but couldn't live together. And even after marriage, some couples didn't cohabit until land was secured. Marriage was as much a business contract as a spiritual bond. And once the ceremony ended, everyone prepared for what came next. The feast, the rituals, and of course, the infamous first night. Once the ceremony was over, the real fun began, the wedding feast. For peasants, the feast was modest, but joyful. Homemade bread, stew, ale. For nobles, it was a lavish banquet with roasted meats and sweet pastries. Feasts could go on for hours or even days, depending on wealth and status. Guests came from surrounding villages, sometimes uninvited. The entire community was expected to witness and celebrate. Entertainment included jugglers, musicians, dancers, and even fire breathers. Games were played, stories were told, and wine flowed freely. In some cases, nobles brought in live animals for spectacle. Wolves, bears, or falcons were used for shows and games. The more dramatic the feast, the more powerful the family appeared. It wasn't just about celebrating love, it were showing off. Food was symbolic. Honey represented fertility. Bread represented unity. Dishes were often shaped into symbols, hearts, crosses, or family crests. Even seating arrangements reflected social rank and family politics. The bride and groom were treated like royalty, but often looked overwhelmed. Many had barely spoken to each other before the ceremony. There was an air of excitement, but also a tension. Everyone knew what was coming. After the feast, some cultures led the bride and groom to the marriage bed. This was done publicly, or at least semi-publicly, in front of witnesses. It wasn't considered rude. It was tradition meant to ensure legitimacy. Guests would throw flowers, sing songs, and lead the way with torches. It could feel more like a ceremony than a private moment. Sometimes, the couple even drank a fertility potion made of herbs and honey. Others would gift them objects believed to bring children: figs, rabbits, wheat. Everything was about blessing the couple's future and family line. Once they were led away, the crowd partied harder, less formal, more wild. The older guests stayed behind to bless the bed, while the young kept drinking. In the background, a strange and awkward ritual was about to unfold. The first night of marriage in the Middle Ages was about more than intimacy. Unlike today, the first night of a medieval marriage wasn't completely private. In noble families, it was often a publicly observed ritual. Some weddings required witnesses to stand near the bed. They didn't watch the act, but they ensured the marriage was consummated. This was especially true in royal or political unions. A marriage wasn't considered valid unless consummation took place. If not, it could be annulled even years later. Sometimes, a bishop or priest would bless the bed before the couple entered. In a few cases, symbolic items like swords or crucifixes were placed on the bed. These were meant to protect the couple and sanctify the act. Candles were lit, flowers were scattered, and prayers were whispered. The bride was expected to be a virgin, a huge source of pressure. Failure to prove this could damage her reputation or her entire family's. In some areas, bed sheets were inspected for blood the next day. If blood was present, it was celebrated. If not, suspicions arose. The groom could boast about proof, but the bride had no such privilege. This created immense stress, especially for young girls who were scared. For noblemen, it was often a duty, not a romantic experience. Sometimes, the groom was older, 30s or 40s, while the bride was a teenager. It was less about love and more about producing an heir. For peasants, the first night could still be the couple might sleep in a shared family home or even a barn. Privacy was rare. Many homes had only one room. Still, neighbors and friends treated the night with importance. In some villages, pranksters would bang on walls or throw peas at the door. This was called chivalry, a noisy ritual to mark the wedding night. It was partly tradition, partly mockery, and often meant to embarrass. But behind the jokes was a deep social belief. Marriage meant duty, and the first night wasn't about pleasure, it was about proving legitimacy. It was the first test of a new, often terrifying chapter in life. The church played a huge role in medieval marriages spiritually and socially. It taught that marriage was sacred, a bond blessed by God, but it also had strict rules about what that meant in practice. Sex was only allowed within marriage and only for the purpose of having children. Pleasure wasn't forbidden, but it was definitely discouraged. The church warned couples not to be lustful even with each other. There were lists of holy days when sex was forbidden, sometimes half the year. These included Lent, Advent, Sundays, and before communion. Breaking these rules could be considered a sin, even within marriage. The church believed the man was the spiritual leader of the household. The wife's role was to obey, support, and bear children. Fidelity was expected of both, but punishment differed wildly. A cheating wife could be humiliated or worse. A cheating husband, often forgiven, especially if wealthy. Confession was encouraged. Priests sometimes asked about a couple's bedroom life. They could give penance for sexual sins. For married people, priests taught that husbands should not treat wives as objects, but society didn't always listen. Wives were sometimes treated like property, especially in the upper classes. The church tried to protect them, issuing marriage laws and rights, but enforcement depended on local lords, not always the church itself. Marriage was meant to reflect the bond between Christ and the church. The husband was the Christ figure, the wife the church. This metaphor justified male dominance in the home. Still, some records showed genuine affection between, especially in lower classes, where survival required partnership. The church also promoted mutual respect. at least in theory. Sermons often reminded husbands to treat wives gently, and wives were told to be patient and virtuous. While the church imposed many rules, it also gave marriage a sense of meaning. Even when love wasn't the reason for marrying, faith gave couples purpose. And in a harsh world, purpose often meant everything. For medieval women, marriage was often the most defining moment of life, but it rarely meant freedom or partnership in the way we understand today. A woman went straight from obeying her father to obeying her husband. She had little to no say in whom she married or when. Her value was often judged by her dowry, her chastity, and her ability to bear children. In noble families, daughters were bargaining tools for diplomacy. In peasant households, they were expected to help in fields, cook, and raise children. Once married, a woman was legally absorbed into her husband's identity. She couldn't own land, make contracts, or defend herself in court without him. In many cases, she couldn't even travel alone or speak publicly. Domestic work was constant cooking, spinning, brewing, gardening, and caring for livestock. Raising children wasn't optional, it was her primary duty. If she couldn't produce a male heir, she was blamed even though, science says, it's the man. Some husbands took mistresses openly, while wives remained confined. Widows had slightly more freedom. They could inherit property and remarry, but that too depended on class. Peasant widows often remarried quickly for survival. Abuse within marriage existed, and there were few protections. The church condemned cruelty but rarely punished husbands. A woman who refused her husband's desires could be accused of disobedience. Marital rape wasn't even recognized as a concept. It was assumed a wife owed sex, but not all marriages were miserable. Some records describe true companionship, shared labor, mutual support, and survival struggles sometimes brought couples closer. In cities, merchant wives helped run shops and manage finances. In monasteries, nuns wrote about love, equality, and the hope for better unions. Poems and songs hinted that some couples did fall in love after marriage, but these were exceptions, not the norm. For most women, marriage was the beginning of lifelong labor and silence. Their lives were shaped not by their dreams but by the expectations of men. In that world, a woman's voice in marriage was barely a whisper, and yet they endured, quietly, powerfully, and often invisibly. Men in the Middle Ages saw marriage very differently than women. It was about legacy, land, and responsibility, but also about control. Fathers wanted to marry off their sons to increase wealth or social rank. A nobleman could gain land through his wife, along with strategic alliances. Peasant men sought wives who could share labor and bear strong children. Beauty wasn't the top priority. Hard work and modesty mattered more. A man was expected to rule his household, discipline children, manage finances. He had legal authority over his wife, even in personal matters. This meant control over what she wore, where she went, even whom she spoke to. Still, marriage was not always easy for men either. There was pressure to provide, protect, and produce an heir. A childless marriage could be seen as a failure, especially among nobles. Men could be shamed for having weak seed if no sons were born. Marriage also meant settling down. No more soldiering, no more taverns. Some men struggled with the loss of personal freedom. However, others embraced the structure marriage offered. A good wife could help run an estate or a farm more efficiently. Husbands often relied on wives more than they admitted. Letters from crusaders show men pleading with their wives to manage lands in their absence. Some even praised their wives' wisdom and strength, but this didn't change the imbalance of power. Even a kind husband was still seen as his wife's guardian. If a man died, the property usually went to sons. Now the widow. Marrying again was common, often within months, especially if children needed care. Men were allowed more sexual freedom, with fewer social consequences. Affairs were tolerated if kept quiet. Prostitutes were available in cities, but if a wife strayed, punishment was severe, sometimes fatal. This double standard was rooted in control over inheritance and bloodlines. A man wanted to be sure his heir was truly his. So while men had more freedom, they were also trapped by pride, honor, and legacy. And many carried that weight until the grave. The Middle Ages were filled with superstition, and marriage was no exception. People believed that spirits and omens could affect a union. The day of the week you married mattered. Wednesday was considered best, Friday worst. Even the direction the wind blew could signal a good or bad marriage. Certain herbs were used in bouquets to ward off evil spirits. Garlic, rosemary, and rue were said to protect fertility and love. Shoes were tied to the couple's cart or thrown at them for lucerne, early form of just married. In some villages, brides wore red ribbons to scare off demons. Dreaming of water the night before a wedding was believed to signal emotional storms. If a bird flew over the couple during the ceremony, it was a good omen. But if it cried or pooped, it foretold sadness or betrayal. People believed that sex before the wedding would curse the couple's future. In fact, some couples fasted for days to purify themselves before the wedding night. Wearing someone else's wedding ring was thought to transfer their fate. Many brides carried coins or bread in their shoes to ensure prosperity. Midwives gave women fertility charms made from bones, wood, or fabric. Some couples slept with a blessed rock under their bed to ensure strong sons. Others placed animal skulls near the doorway for protection. Even the order in which the couple stepped into their home mattered. Right foot first. A black cat crossing the path to the wedding was a very bad sign. Loud noises, bells, shouting, even firecrackers were used to scare away bad luck. Spilling wine on the bride was said to bring good fortune. Dropping the wedding bread, however, meant disaster. Married couples were often told not to cut bread at the same time. It meant division. And finally, it was believed that if a couple shared a piece of cake silently, they'd live in harmony. Superstitions might seem strange now, but back then, they gave people comfort. In a world filled with war, disease, and poverty, every small sign mattered. Marriage wasn't just a contract, it was seen as a spiritual battle, and people would do anything to protect even if it meant whispering to ghosts. Once the feast ended and the guests left, the real work of marriage began. For most couples, the honeymoon didn't exist. Life returned to survival. The wife usually moved into her husband's home, often with his family. There was no privacy, no personal space, just shared labor and shared walls. Peasant couples lived in one-room cottages, often with animals inside. The days started early, before sunrise, and ended only when the chores did. Men worked in fields, hunted, or traded. Women managed the home and children. In noble homes, there was more luxury but also more pressure. The wife was expected to produce heirs, manage servants, and keep up appearances. Both noble and peasant women were judged by how well they served. Married, life wasn't filled with affection, it was filled with expectations. Couples often had many children, not all of whom survived childhood. Children were considered blessings, but also additional mouths to feed. Illness, hunger, and war were constant threats to the family unit. Still, many couples grew closer through shared hardships. Love wasn't always present at first, but respect and loyalty could grow. In time, a husband might admire his wife's strength and resilience, and a wife might feel pride in building a home, even with limited rights. They prayed together, planted together, buried children together. Their bond was forged in survival, not flowers and poetry. For noble families, married life could be lonely, especially for young brides in foreign courts. They were often homesick, isolated, and expected to be perfect. Many wrote letters back home, expressing sadness and fear. For some, married life became a prison, especially in unhappy marriages. But for others, it brought status, security, and the beginnings of real partnership. The church urged couples to live with patience, faith, and duty, and many did because they had no other choice. Marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't the end of a love story. It was the start of a long, often difficult journey one walked side by side, step by step, sometimes with love, often without, but always with purpose. Aired into the countryside and built lives in secret. Romantic songs and poems were inspired by these rare love stories. They gave people hope even if most marriages were arranged. Famous tales like Tristan and Isolde or Abelard and Heloise show forbidden love. They remind us that even in a rigid world, passion still burned. In some regions, laws eventually allowed couples to marry for love with witness consent, but this was rare, and often only after battles with parents or lords. Love marriages were seen as risky because feelings could change. Still, among peasants, some couples married by choice, especially when families had little to lose. They built homes with their own hands, raised children on their own terms, and while they lacked luxury, they had something richer: freedom. Not every secret love story ended in tragedy. Some couples beat the odds and lived long lives together. These rare unions passed down as village legends, proof that love could triumph. It was dangerous to defy tradition, but it wasn't impossible. The heart, even in the Middle Ages, still had a voice. And when that voice was loud enough, it could rewrite destinies. So yes, most marriages were cold, arranged, and full of duty, but a few were warm, wild, and brave. And those stories remind us that even in the darkest times, love found a way. Maybe not often, maybe not easily, but it did. And that spark still echoes, centuries later.